Hi everyone. I think we'll make a start. We're just over 100 attendees, so thank you all for joining. I think this might be our last virtual Advances of a Field Experiment seminar this year, this semester at the very least. We got the conference in 2 weeks, but I think we'll sort of end it here today. So we're very happy to have Matt Lowe and Salma Mousa giving today's seminars. It's great to have them both together, given the recent interest in both of their papers. Salma's paper just got accepted into Science, so congratulations to Salma. And Matt's paper is R&R at the AER, so congratulations to Matt too. You know, both papers are looking at a very similar phenomena, contact theory, which has been largely ignored, especially in economics, but a lot more interest recently. And they are both using field experiments. They're both gathering their own data. And what's exciting for me, they're using sport as the lens to do that, which is really, really great. So we'll have Matt giving his paper first, and then Salma will give her paper straight after. So Matt is an assistant professor of economics at the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC in Canada. He was a postdoc at the Brick Institute prior to that and completed his PhD at MIT. So Matt, over to you.
Great. Okay, thank you, Rob. So yeah, today we have this double header on the contact hypothesis. So the first thing I'll do is give a very brief potted history of where this idea came from. So psychologists really got interested in this idea of intergroup contact in the 1940s. So with a background of racial conflict in the US, there are a few psychologists doing these studies where essentially they looked at the effects of integration of whites with blacks on ships in the Navy and in housing and these sorts of kind of different contexts. And so what happens then is that Gordon Allport, who's this psychologist at Harvard, he writes this book in 1954 called The Nature of Prejudice. And this is where he lays out really a reconciliation of the existing results and a theory of how he would say contact works. And so in this book, essentially, he says that intergroup reduces prejudice, but only if these particular conditions are met. So for Allport, these are necessary conditions, that you need all four of these conditions for contact to work. And the conditions are that these groups that are being introduced, they should have common goals, they should be cooperating together to achieve those goals. The groups in this situation should have equal status, and there should be the support or sanction of some authority figure of this intergroup contact. So then the question that motivates my paper is, what do we actually know about whether these conditions matter? And, for this, we can look at this recent meta-analysis by Betsy Pallock and co-authors. So this is a meta-analysis of experimental estimates of contact. And what they conclude is that contact typically reduces prejudice, but we still know very little about whether these conditions matter. So this contact hypothesis, which is a conditional hypothesis, been around for 70 years, there still hasn't really been research on whether for contact to work, we do or do not need these conditions. Okay, now why should we care about that? So one reason is that if policymakers are going to design these policies to introduce different groups, then we'd want to know ideally how we can optimize these policies. So what sort of features and conditions do these policies need in order to maximize effects? And related, we might wonder whether restructuring contact could change the effects of contact that we see in both experiments and in kind of more naturally. So, here there's been some recent examples from political science of contact interventions that have either had mostly null or kind of completely null effects. And then there are also these more natural examples of exposure to immigrants and refugees that tend to have negative effects, usually in the political domain. So it's kind of an open question of whether you can take these null and negative effects and turn them positive if only there was a different type of contact that people had in the first place. So this is where my paper comes in. So what do? So I randomized two different types of contact, and this really focuses mainly on the common goals condition that Gordon Allport talks about. So I have the effects of collaborative contact, which is contact where the groups have common goals. And then I have the effects of adversarial contact, which is contact where the groups have opposing goals. Okay, so this is how I did it. So this is a field experiment in northern India. This is like an area in India where in villages people live separately by caste. So in one village, multiple castes co-reside, but each hamlet is dominated by one particular caste, and so people are quite geographically segregated. And it's also an area where there's a lot of caste discrimination. So a large proportion of upper caste practice untouchability, which means they follow these norms and rules of pollution and purity that mean in practice that the upper caste will be avoiding particular types of contact with the lower caste. So this is a context where people are kind of ex ante highly segregated, and there's some amount of antagonism. And then this is where the sports comes in. So in this case, I organized cricket leagues in 8 different rural locations. This was a means of firstly integrating people. I had over 1,200 men play these leagues, over 600 matches. And what's cool about India and using cricket is that these men really love playing cricket. 47% of them say they play cricket every single day. So this way of integrating people is not kind of unusual. It's a pretty natural way of bringing these men together across caste lines. Then the experiment design has 3 main aspects. So the first is that these men were randomly assigned to either play in the leagues or to be in a pure control group. So having these 2 groups allows me to estimate the effects of the program as a whole. Then second, and importantly, if they're in the leagues, they're randomly assigned to teams. So that creates exogenous variation in what fraction of your teammates belong to a different caste. So that's what I call collaborative contact, because teammates together have the common goal of winning the matches. And then these teams were randomly assigned to opponents. So that's where the adversarial contact comes from, because there's then going to be exogenous variation in what fraction of your opponents belong to a different caste. Okay, so this is what I'll talk about today. Firstly, these 2 types of contact have opposite effects on demand for social interaction. So if I put you in a team with other castes, then you end up with more friendships from those other castes. Whereas if you face more other castes as opponents, not only do you not make friends, make cross-caste friendships, you actually lose cross-caste friendships. And both of these effects seem to extend to the caste group as a whole. So that means that you're not just becoming friends with your teammates, you're then also wanting to interact socially with other people from that caste that were not on your team, and similarly for the effects of adversarial contact. Then in the domain of more economic interactions, I use a trading exercise to see whether these types of contact also affect whether people interact to trade with one another. And then this is an exercise where you can quantify essentially the efficiency gains that people exploit from this trading. So here I can also show that collaborative contact increases efficiency in trading, so it has some kind of economic efficiency impacts. Third, I can aggregate the effects of both of these types of contact by looking at effects on an omnibus index of cross-caste behavior. So partly I'll emphasize this today because I don't have time to talk about all the other outcomes in the paper. So this index includes the friendships and the trading, but it also includes some other outcomes of choosing other castes for a future team and trust. And then finally, these first 3 results, all about what does contact do. The 4th result says, well, what does the program as a whole do? And here I find that league participation reduces caste division on net. So you're better off in the leagues than out of the leagues, which suggests that these positive aspects of the contact in the leagues more than offset any negative aspects. Okay. So what's this paper do? I mean, I think this is probably clear by now. This is intending to be a paper that takes seriously these conditions that Allport proposes and actually, shows what happens when you vary them. There have been a lot of other recent, very well done papers on contact that are complementary in many ways, and the one, of course, is Salma Mousa's. So we'll see Salma's immediately after this. Otherwise, I'm able to estimate the effects of contact on efficiency, and then having this pure control group means I can evaluate the effects of the program as a whole. Okay, so let me now describe in more detail the experiment, and then I'll get into each of these results, and depending on time, we'll see how far I get through them. So these cricket leagues, I organized 8 of them in 8 different locations. And this is how they ran. So each of the leagues have 20 teams, and each of the teams have only 5 players. So if you play cricket or you actually watch cricket, then you'll know this is like a bit more unusual. Usually the teams have more players. So this is, the experimental trick to try and increase statistical power. So things were a little bit different here to try and make things easier on me. And then each of these teams plays 8 matches over the course of a month. And these matches are short as well, so they're not these crazy long 5-day test matches. They're 40 minutes on average. So this is kind of geared towards having these quick matches so people can play a bunch of them over a short period. And so in total, that means that people have on average about 5 to 10 hours of contact. So it's not that intensive, and you'll see that it still has effects. Now, for everyone who's watching and thinking, what the heck is cricket? I've never heard of this thing. All I know is, it's really boring, which is probably what most people think. This is what it looks like. So this is a photo from one of the matches. One point of reference is that if you are American or familiar with American culture, then it's pretty similar in structure to baseball, which I actually don't know anything about. But this is actually how it works. I can also explain. So here there are two batsmen who are currently forming a partnership, and one of them here is waiting by the wooden stumps to receive the ball, and he's going to hit the ball with his bat once it comes to him. And then these two men have to coordinate their running between the stumps when he hits the ball. Their three teammates who are waiting to bat are all by the side of the pitch, sat together, and they're playing against a team that's currently bowling and fielding. So this bowler holds the ball, he's going to throw it towards the batter, and the fielder here is waiting patiently to receive the ball. And so they're going to have to kind of coordinate who gets the ball and who gives it back. So on their team, all 5 of the players are currently on the pitch. This is a very simple introduction. Okay, so this is how the timeline roughly progressed.
Hi, Matthew.
Yep.
I'm sorry. So this is great. Just a quick question. So what is the baseline level of contact in the control and treatment groups? Because you're talking about adding 5 to 10 hours on some natural variation that should already be in the data because they might work or play other games with cross group.
Yep.
Can you give us a sense of the baseline that you're adding these 5 or 10 hours on top of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best data I have on the baseline, which is not ideal, is just measures of social networks at baseline. So, you know that I know how many friends people have, from their own caste versus other castes. And people have about twice as many friends from their own caste than from other castes, despite the fact that there are twice as many people from other castes than their own caste. So on some level, people are pretty segregated at baseline. You can make some comparison to racial segregation in American schools. They're substantially more segregated than that. But they will still have like the odd friend from a different caste, so it's not totally extreme. Then there's like a separate question of, what types of interaction are they having with other castes, even if they're not friends with them. And there it's like a little bit less clear, at least I don't have good data on that, but you can imagine that they will have some interaction with them in the village because they live in the same village together and go to the same shops, but the interaction is likely not that collaborative.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out, because if you're adding such a small number of hours on what feels like it should be a baseline or a stock of hundreds, it feels strange to me that that new flow could lead to such a large outcome difference on top of an already pretty large stock.
Yeah, okay, well, so let me say two things. One is that it's not clear what the stock is of, collaborative contact. So, I mean, I don't have good data on that, so I can't say anything very strong, but it's possible that especially the collaborative contact in teams is actually quite, meaningful relative to the baseline. And the second thing is that the effects I'm finding are pretty short run, right? So I don't know if they're meaningfully, changing things in the long run. It could be that, the immediate contact you've had recently does form short run attitudes and short run social networks pretty rapidly. So I think that's one way to think about it.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I don't want to slow you down too much. I just thought that's got to be an important consideration in how you're going to interpret your results and how strong you feel your results are.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Okay, so 1,261 men sign up to play in these leagues. And these men belong to 3 different caste groups. They're either general, OBC, or SC/ST. So when I talk about in-group, out-group, it relates to these 3 groups. If you're a general caste, then the out-group for you or the cross-caste for you are OBC and SC/ST. And these are all men aged 14 to 30. Now, in the first step, they're randomized to either be in the leagues or to be in a control group. So 800 players in the league. And then if you're in the league, you're randomized to teams. Now, I rigged this randomization so that 35% of the teams are kept completely caste homogeneous. So in a given team, all 5 players belong to the same caste, whereas in these other teams, you're across the whole spectrum. So someone can have 1 other caste in their team, some can have 2, some can have 3, some can have 4. And now when we call these teams up and ask them to play, we can't guarantee that all of them will be able to attend a given match. So if some of them can't attend, then what we do is we use these control group players to try to replace and act as substitutes for people that can't play. So the way this works is that I take all the control group players, I split them into the 3 castes, and I randomly order them within each caste. And then if a general caste player can't play, I first call up the #1 priority general caste control group player and try and get them to replace them. And then if they can't play, I go down to #2, #3, and so on. And that achieves 2 things. One is that it preserves the original caste composition of each team as originally randomly assigned. And the second is that it preserves a pure control group, which are these higher priority numbers that are in the backup. So I'll use them right at the end to talk about the effects of the program as a whole. Okay, so people are assigned to teams. Then I pick a match schedule randomly, and that implicitly randomly assigns people to opponents as well. So that process of picking a match schedule randomly turns out to be equivalent to a network problem. So I use an existing algorithm for that, which is not important to go over. The one thing that is important to mention is that the way this works, you end up with much less variation in what fraction of your opponents are other castes than what fraction of your teammates are other castes. So that reduces some power to identify effects of adversarial contact. And that's also one reason why using this omnibus index is helpful, because it increases some power by aggregating all of these outcomes together. Okay, so this is the spec now that I'll get to for the results. So to estimate the effects of contact, I have these 800 people who are assigned to the leagues in this specification. YSCL some outcome for participant I from one of these 3 castes in League L include strata fixed effects. And this I mentioned to John, these outcomes are measured 1 to 3 weeks after the league ended. So this is one thing that's very nice about Salma's paper that we'll see, which she has much longer term outcomes. And then in this spec, I'm always including both the collaborative contact treatment and the adversarial contact treatment. So that's the fraction of your teammates that belong to a different caste and the fraction of your opponents that belong to a different caste. And then I'm controlling for baseline friends and the variables used for re-randomization. I cluster the standard errors at the team level. Okay, let me talk about the first results. This on social interaction. So, one reason that it's interesting to think about social networks and social interaction, especially in the domain of caste, is that a lot of this work on caste by Kaivan Munshi and others finds that caste networks are really important for various economic activities like risk sharing, migration, and occupational mobility. So it seems interesting to ask, how does contact affect, these caste networks, your willingness to interact across caste lines? So I do this in a very simple way. After the leagues are over, people self-report their social networks. So they go on a tablet and they scroll through a randomly ordered list of all the participants in their area. They see the photo of each player and the full name of each player. The full name will signal the caste. And they make 2 selections. So first they select anyone that they consider to be friends or people they want to spend time with in future. And then second, they select just the people they consider to be friends. So you can think of this as, selecting weaker friendships and stronger friendships. And then I calculate the number of other caste participants people select. And so this is what I find. So this is the first main result, that there's opposite effects of each type of contact on the number of other castes that you want to interact with. So the first selection. So, on the left here, this is the effects of collaborative contact. The x-axis is the fraction of my team that belong to a different caste. And then you have the people who had 1 other caste in their team, 2 other castes, 3 and 4. And each of these bubbles reflects the sample size. The size is proportional to the sample size in each bin. And then for adversarial contact, it's the fraction of my opponents from another caste. And the dashed line here is coming exactly from this beta here, and the dashed line here from this gamma here. So the figure on the left is telling us that as someone goes from having 0 other castes in their team to having 4, they end up with 2.2 additional cross castes, other castes that they list as they wanting to interact with. just with smaller magnitudes, given that people select fewer friendships than they do than the people they want to interact with. Now, one important question here is
a quick question, Matt. Sorry, on the last slide. Was the demand stated, or was there some like actual revealed choices that you could see that they actually did integrate or did have friendships in the future?
Good. Okay, yeah. So for both of these outcomes, it's stated. The next outcome I'll get to is real trading behavior, where you have to actually interact with them. So that'll kind of show you as well that people are definitely seeing each other as well. And the other thing is that these friendship reports are extremely predictive of who people actually trade with, including just the cross-caste friendship report. So they seem to be kind of somewhat, meaningful of actual interaction.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so one question we might ask now is, well, are people just changing their mind about the people that they immediately interact with? So, am I just becoming friends with my teammates, or am I actually now also wanting to interact with people from that caste group in general? So the way that I look at this is I change the outcome slightly. So for collaborative contact, I now want to exclude your teammates, and I want to say, do you become friends with the people from the other caste that weren't even on your team? And so for that, I take all the people on the other teams in your league. They're assigned to other teams, so by definition, they cannot play with you. And I ask, what percentage of the other castes from those other teams are you now friends with? And then for adversarial contact, I do something slightly different, because here you want to exclude the opponents, so you don't want the people on the other teams. So here I say, let's look at all the backups that played 0 matches. What fraction of them do you become friends with? And essentially, there's reasonable evidence that these effects at least somewhat extend to the caste group. So there's still positive effect of collaborative contact, and still a negative effect of adversarial contact. And so it suggests it's not just about becoming friends or losing friendships with the people you immediately interact with. It also generalizes somewhat. Okay, so let me now talk about economic interactions. So here we can connect to a particular type of economic interaction, which is trading behavior. And one thing that's kind of sets the scene is this nice paper by a colleague of mine, Shu and Anderson. So what she shows is that in this area, so in northern India, caste barriers impede trade. And so she shows this for markets for irrigation water, where she says it's basically hard for low caste to buy water from high caste. And as a result, if you're a buyer of water and you're a lower caste, you have much higher yields if you're in a village where the sellers are also low caste. So this is a setting which caste seems to be an impediment to trade. And so we can now ask, in my experiment, does cross-caste contact affect these social barriers to trade? And the way that I do that is I designed a new trading exercise as a way of having a setting in which everyone is going to be trading, and I can observe exactly who has traded with who. So this is how that trading exercise works. Every participant was given 2 goods. So they're given a pair of gloves and they're given a pair of flip-flops. And these goods have unique IDs. But these goods were intentionally mismatched to create gains from trade. So if you look at this picture on the right, you'll see these are really nice gloves, but they're both left-handed, so they're pretty useless. So you either get left-handed gloves or you get right-handed gloves, or you get 2 left-footed flip-flops or 2 right-footed flip-flops. So you receive this good, it's pretty useless, and we tell you you have 5 days to go out and find someone that you can trade with. Now the second part is that I also layer on monetary incentives, and these incentives are for you to trade with a different color. So here you can see the color is green. There are 2 other colors. So why do I do that? Well, the colors are assigned to people to nearly perfectly correlate with caste. And so these incentives create, for half of the sample, they create gains from cross-caste trade. So now we've created these efficiency gains, and we want to see if these efficiency gains are exploited by the people who had contact. 88% of these goods are traded, so the action is not really going to be on the extensive margin, it's going to be on the intensive margin of who trades with who. And so this is what I show here. So in the first column, you can see there's basically no effect of contact on whether you trade. And then the second column, this is whether you trade with someone from a different caste. So if you're in a homogeneous caste team, about 52% of the trades are cross-caste. The incentives increase these cross-caste trades a lot. And there's maybe a somewhat positive effect of collaborative contact on cross-caste trade in general, increasing by up to 6 percentage points. Negative but imprecise effect of adversarial contact. And then if I look just at these people that had those efficiency gains, so just these people who had the incentives, collaborative contact is increasing cross-caste trade by up to 11 percentage points. And that's also having this payout effect. They're making more money. So this is a sense in which contact and only collaborative contact appears to be having a bit of an efficiency effect. And on Rob's point, it's also showing us that this is leading to more actual real world interactions, in this case, to make these trades. Okay, now one way to summarize both what I've said so far and also other outcomes in the paper is to show what the effects are on an aggregate index of cross-caste behaviors. So for this, I make an index that includes everything I've showed you so far, and it also includes 2 additional measures. So the number of other castes you choose for a future team, both for a match with and without stakes, and then the trust gap. So what you give in a trust game to others minus your own caste, and also levels of trust. So the nice thing here is that, you know, if you want to just remember one thing from this presentation, then this is the figure you remember. This nicely summarizes the overall point of the paper, which is that collaborative contact increases cross-caste behaviors. The magnitudes are about 0.2 of a standard deviation as you go from no one in your team to everyone in your team being from a different caste. And adversarial contact has the opposite effect with a bigger magnitude, about 0.4 standard deviations, and you can reject these 2 effects. And one thing that's maybe somewhat interesting here as well is that, as we'll see if I understand Salma's paper correctly, Salma has variations so that the teams are about here. And in my study, it actually looks like, if anything, you know, these effects might be nonlinear. There's not much of an effect here, and that the effects kick in more here. So I think one paper that neither of us right now, I think, can really answer, but one question that's maybe interesting is whether these effects of contact might be nonlinear. Okay, I think I am, right, somewhat running out of time, so let me...
1 minute to finish up.
Okay, okay, so let me go very quickly through 3 more things I guess the paper can speak to, but I won't be able to give them the justice, give them much justice. So the first is just a simple question about policy. So within the leagues, there are different types of contact, but what is the net effect of being in a league versus in control? And so here I show that for the 3 outcomes I've discussed: friends, trade, and the cross-caste behavior index. But let's just focus on this. So what you can see is that if you're in a homogeneous caste team relative to pure control, there's still about a 0.1 standard deviation positive effect. And if you're in a mixed caste team, it's about 0.2 standard deviation. So on net, being in these leagues is reducing, you know, caste division, even though these leagues comprise different types of contact. And then I think perhaps more interesting, there's 2 points I can make in this project about 2 of the other conditions emphasized by Gordon Allport. So the first condition is that he says that as well as common goals, people need to cooperate together to achieve those goals. I tried to vary that cooperation by randomizing the monetary incentives the teams got to play. So they either get unequal individual-based pay or equal team-based pay. It turns out that those monetary incentives don't matter at all, which suggests that common goals in this setting is in some sense sufficient for positive effects of contact. You don't need this additional cooperation. You can throw some competition in there and it's not going to matter. And then finally, the effects are very similar for the lower and the upper caste, despite the fact that there's unequal status between these groups within teams. The lower castes are worse at cricket and they're also discriminated against. Okay, so let me conclude. My paper basically shows some qualified support for Allport's conditions. On the one hand, common goals seem to be important. On the other hand, and that was just the last slide, 2 of the other conditions seem to be less important. And the one short thing I'd say about future work is that I don't think there's any reason why in future we should limit ourselves to these 4 conditions. In fact, there's one good reason not to, which is that several recent, very well done Allport optimized studies still find null effects of contact. So I think one way to go now is to consider other factors that might boost the effects of contact even beyond these 4 conditions. So thank you everyone for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. That's really awesome stuff. We've got a bunch of questions. You're more than welcome to, as Salma presents, go through them and respond to them. That would be awesome.
Yep,
that'd
great.
Great.
Thank you.
And everyone's really happy about that cricket bat in the background. Cool, thanks, Matt. That was really great. Okay, next we have Salma Mousa. Salma is a postdoc fellow at the Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab and Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. Prior to that, she did, well, I think this year she finished a PhD at the Political Science Department at Stanford. And her research is generally in thinking about social cohesion after conflict, which is obviously very relevant to today's paper. Obviously, Salma has done a lot of field experiments in this area, but also has a paper on the impact of Mo Salah on racial beliefs and preferences, and a big Mo Salah fan like most of us here, apart from the Manchester United fans. So, Salma, over to you.
Thanks everyone for having me and for setting this up, Rob, and the team at VAIF. This is just my dream to have this kind of format for me and Matt to get feedback and have hopefully a great discussion at the end. So I'm here to present results from a field experiment on intergroup contact and social cohesion in post-ISIS Iraq, and wanted to take a second to acknowledge JPAL and IPA for the heavy lift in funding this project. So let me take you back to the summer of 2014, and a lot of us were very horrified to see ISIS take over large swaths of territory in northern Iraq and Syria. That campaign involved the ethnic cleansing of religious minorities, so primarily Yazidis, but also smaller numbers of Christians and Muslim groups as well. Hundreds of thousands of whom were forcibly displaced pretty much overnight from this orange area on the map on the left here into the relative safety of the green Kurdish-held area. As you can imagine, that trauma of that displacement experience really devastated social relations in the area. One of the reasons for that is that most people thought that displacement would last for a couple of days. One mom that I spoke to said she was expecting to come home after the weekend and only packed enough clothes for her kids for the weekend. But they were actually displaced for closer to 3 years. And when they did come back, this is what they found. They found that their churches, their schools, their businesses were pretty much destroyed, torched from the inside out. And these pictures are pretty recent, actually. So these places still look like this. These are the two of the biggest churches in the city of Karakosh where the study takes place. They also found similar levels of damage to their homes. So on the left, here's a picture of a picture I took of a house I visited in Karakosh, where you can see the AC in the corner there has been pried off the wall, and there's the beginnings of a tunnel actually that some ISIS fighters had actually tried to start digging a tunnel to get out when they were being closed in on. On the right here is a picture of another house belonging to Christians, and the graffiti says that the Islamic State will live on. And the people who live in this house, like I was like, why don't you just paint over this? Why would you want to be reminded? And they were very, very adamant that they would not paint over it, and they wanted to preserve this graffiti all over the town as being part of their collective memory and a testament to the world of what happened to them. So with this kind of trauma and kind of collective trauma, it's very ingrained in the identity of these communities now. And it's really deepened social distrust and social segregation in these towns, especially between Christians and Muslims, who are widely seen to be ISIS collaborators if they chose to stay behind when ISIS came to town. And even Muslim groups who themselves were targeted and persecuted by ISIS are resented for even living in these Christian areas in the first place, because they're seen as diluting the Christian heritage of the areas and also diluting the Christian political power in the area. So you have some economic, political, and social reasons for these tensions. But on the whole, they leave us with a really important policy problem, which is how can you build social cohesion after this kind of violence? And this is especially important given that backsliding into violence is very common. Even after the official fighting stops, the lingering prejudices can continue to cause a range of social problems. And so we think that there are tools at both the institutional and grassroots level that can potentially help. So at this institutional level, you might have tools like power sharing arrangements, for example, or other policy tools. And at the grassroots level, one promising path is intergroup contact. And this slide is actually word for word, very similar to the one Matt showed. So I was kind of strategic and encouraging him to go first. So generally, the idea that contact under certain conditions, generally positive, meaningful, cooperative contact, can reduce prejudice does seem to have some solid causal evidence in recent years, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And we really don't know which conditions matter. So this theory has been around for a really long time, and the three main conditions, I've collapsed cooperation and a common goal because I think they're pretty similar. The three main conditions that we have, we actually don't have very many experimental tests of these conditions. So we know from Matt's paper, Matt actually did a lot of legwork here because he showed us evidence on cooperation and equal power status. But aside from this paper, we really don't have a whole host of evidence on the importance of these conditions in different settings. And we also don't know the importance of contact being endorsed by communal authorities. We also don't really know the extent to which contact can spill over into real world behaviors. So most of our evidence comes from within the intervention setting and toward peers who are encountered within the intervention setting, or relying on survey-based measures of intergroup attitudes. But we don't really know, like, do these contact programs, can they really be transformative and change how people navigate the real world long after the intervention ends? And this is especially true in conflict settings and post-conflict settings. And there's good reason why we don't have great evidence on, or a lot of evidence on contact from post-conflict settings, with some important exceptions. Mainly that contact is more likely to be negative in those settings, and we do know that negative contact is definitely bad. So it's understandable, but we do have reason to think that contact in these settings might not operate in the same ways as it does during peacetime. So for example, we know that prejudice is particularly hard to shift among adults, among those who are exposed to violence, and especially when the prejudice itself is ethnic or religious, as opposed to prejudice toward the elderly or the disabled, for example, which is easier to move. And these are all generally true in conflict settings. So what I'm going to do is circumvent all of the hard work that Matt did in disentangling these different conditions, and actually hold constant as much as I can these optimal conditions of contact via soccer, and test contact in a post-conflict setting and measure these real-world behaviors. So the research question is, can intergroup contact build tolerant attitudes and behaviors after war? And to preview the main finding, I find that contact did improve everyday behaviors among peers within the intervention, but it really struggled to build that broader social cohesion toward outgroup members outside of the intervention. So diving into the research design, my aim is to increase the Christian tolerance toward Muslims. And this might seem a bit backwards, especially people familiar with the Middle East. The Christians are typically the targeted minority. So the reason for this is twofold. The first is that I happen to have connections to these Christian community organizations. So just from a practical perspective, that's the community I had most access to. And secondly, there are a host of anticipated benefits of building social cohesion between Christians and Muslims, regardless of which group you focus on. So given that anticipated positive effect, we went ahead. So the sample consisted of 42 soccer teams, Christian soccer teams, in 2 different study sites in northern Iraq. So myself and the community organization, the Christian community organization, we went out basically and recruited all of the Christian teams who play in this area, who were all consisted of displaced Christians, and invited them to this new soccer league. We said, like, this league is going to be amazing, and there's going to be professional refs and new uniforms and the bleachers, and people are going to watch. And so people were just really motivated to participate, but we said the one condition for participating is that one of the goals of this league is to increase or to build a sense of community in the area, and we want to make sure people from different groups are included. And so we are going to add some players to your team who may or may not be Christian. And that is effectively the treatment. So the control groups, the Christian team stayed as they were, and we added 3 or 4 Christian players who themselves were drawn from rosters of teams who were not invited to participate, or they might not have been formally a part of a team in the first place. And then the treatment consisted of having 3 or 4 Muslim players added to your team who play with Muslim amateur teams in the area. So we're holding constant this experience of your team getting new guys. The treatment is really whether those new guys are Christians or Muslims. So the program consisted of 4 leagues in 2 different study sites, and they've trained together and competed together for a 2-month league. One of these leagues is kind of a reference league, not quite a pure control like Matt had, so I think that's another great contribution of that paper. So I can talk about that a little bit at the end, but for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the experimental results. And I achieved this randomization using a block randomization, using a baseline survey measure of how much people perceive that they have in common with Muslims. So I take your average response at the team level to that survey question and conduct the randomization based on that. And so the randomization happens at two main levels. First, and it happens at the team level first. So is your team assigned to the treatment or the control group? And then conditional on being assigned to a treatment status, the actual individual players that you get is also randomized. So who are these guys? The median participant is 23 years old, doesn't have a job, is single, and has a high school education. In terms of their intergroup attitudes, they have few to no Muslim friends. I think about 2/3 have no Muslim friends or colleagues. They would not sell land to Muslims. I think only 20% said they would even consider selling land to Muslims, and also would not want to have a Muslim as a neighbor. How do they compare to the general population? They seem pretty similar, a little bit on the less tolerant side. So here I'm comparing the study participants with a survey I ran in the area of over 1,000 displaced Christians. And you can see that the participants are much less proud to be Iraqi, a bit less likely to say that coexistence is possible or to say that Muslims are welcoming or that they would consider selling land to Muslims.
Just a quick question about the impact of your treatment on the contact. Similar question that John had to Matt. What was sort of the additional number of hours of that contact? And what was kind of like the baseline before your study even started?
So if I'm focusing just on the contact that happens through soccer, which is what I have the most information on, of the 50 overall teams in the study, only 2 of them had ever trained with Muslims before the program started. So in the realm of soccer, you had almost no, and in fact, I can say no contact for the vast majority of the teams. Having said that, you do have some variation outside of soccer. So about 1/3 said that they had some Muslim friends or colleagues. And of those, I know through interviews with the players, most of them are either like policemen or in the army. And so they belong to these national institutions where they kind of have some Muslim coworkers, but that's still very much the minority, I would say. So the dominant norm is that there's not much contact, and especially in terms of friendships and playing sports and things for fun, like not outside of mandatory office environments, it's very low. So I'd say the impact, especially in the realm of these social relations, is quite high relative to the baseline.
Got it. Thank you.
So how am I gonna measure whether this worked? So I have a range of behaviors that I call on the field versus off the field behaviors, as well as a battery of attitudes. So on the field behaviors is what I'm calling behaviors in the realm of soccer, towards the peers who you encounter in the intervention. So toward your teammates or toward the other guys in the league. So the 3 outcomes I look at here, first is whether you register for a mixed team next season. The second is whether you vote for a Muslim who's not on your team to receive a sportsmanship award. And so this I actually took from Matt. This is a great idea. And the idea is that you're excluding your teammates. You can't vote for someone on your team. And I limited this to just the new guys who were added. So you have this list of the new guys who were added, like Christians and Muslims, and you have this list in front of you, and you have to pick the best sportsmanship prize to go to the best newcomer award. And actually, the list is longer of Christian players, because if you're in a treated group, you can't vote for your own teammates. So it's actually kind of biased in favor of voting for a Christian to receive that award. And then lastly, I look at whether you still train with Muslims 6 months after the intervention ended. And most of those are those who were assigned to your team, but about, I think maybe it's 1/4 of the ones who actually were still training with Muslims were training with those who they recruited from the neighborhood. Moving to off the field behaviors, I wanted to capture how people are behaving around Muslims outside the intervention, Muslim strangers, to capture this sense of broader social cohesion. So first I look at whether you are more likely, if you're on a mixed team, to attend a mixed social event. So this event was organized by the league administration, but it was open to everyone in the neighborhood. And participants knew like this was open not only to them, but also to the Muslims who live in the area, that they would be invited and that they would bring their family and friends. And for one of the leagues, this actually coincided with the fast breaking meal in Ramadan. And so it was made very clear that Muslims would probably be present at this event. So do you attend this event knowing that Muslims will be there, and conditional on attending, do you bring a family member or a friend, a guest? Secondly, I look at whether you patronize a Muslim business in a Muslim part of town. In this case, that town is Mosul. And Mosul is seen as this like hotbed of former ISIS activity. It's a Muslim-dominated city. It's about a 40-minute drive from the study sites. And so the question is, are you more likely, if you're on a mixed team, to overcome these social segregation barriers and actually go to another city where there are very few Christians and go to this restaurant? And I track this using vouchers. So here's an example of the voucher. And so the vouchers are stamped with people's unique IDs, and then we collect them from the restaurant at the end of the study. So these vouchers were actually valid for 3 months after the intervention ended. Then we collected them again and figured out who went. And then lastly, do you donate your $1 survey compensation to a neutral NGO, so an NGO or a cause that serves both Christians and Muslims, or do you choose to donate it to the church? I also look at some attitudes as well. So these are 8 survey items that capture intergroup attitudes that I collapse into 3 indices using a hierarchical clustering method. So just kind of a data-driven way of doing principal components, basically. And these 3 indices I've labeled national unity. So this consists of items like life would be better if we treat each other as Iraqis first, and an item on the arbitrariness of group divisions. The second index I call Muslim blame. So do you blame these various Muslim civilian groups, so not ISIS, for Christian suffering? And the last I call Muslim neighbor. So are you okay with having these various Muslim groups as being one of your neighbors? So now I'm going to jump straight into the main results. So here are these are predicted probabilities that are covariate adjusted, including a control for the randomization block, and the standard errors are clustered at the team level. And what you can see here is, looking first at on the field outcomes on the left panel, you were much more likely to train with Muslims, I think like 40 percentage points more likely to train with Muslims if you're on a mixed team. You're also about 12 percentage points more likely to vote for a Muslim to receive a sportsmanship award. And you're also around 20 percentage points more likely to vote for a Muslim to receive a sportsmanship award. And you were also about 12 percentage points more likely to register for a mixed team next season if you were on a mixed team as opposed to an all-Christian team. Moving to off-the-field outcomes, the effects here are much smaller, generally close to 0, or if not 0, the estimated effects. So you were not detectably more likely to visit Mosul and patronize the restaurant there. You were not more likely to attend the mixed event. And actually, even those who did attend, they also brought their family members at nearly identical rates. And there's also no difference in your propensity to donate your survey compensation to the church as opposed to an NGO or a cause that serves both Muslims and Christians. The right panel just shows the confidence intervals on these effects. And so there seems to be this pattern here that the treatment that the contact moved your likelihood of engaging more positively with the other guys in the league, but it did not really shift how you felt about Muslims more broadly. So are these differences themselves statistically significant? So between the on the field and off the field? So here's an exploratory analysis. Oh, before I dive into that, in terms of attitudes, it's not shown here, but contact did improve the National Unity Index quite a lot. This was composed of those abstract beliefs and coexistence kind of items, but there were no change to Muslim blame or Muslim neighbors. So when I ask specific questions about Muslims, I don't see any change. And again, this could be reflective of asking about Muslims more broadly, and that there's potentially this difference between people you know and don't know that's important. So testing these on the field and off the field outcomes directly against each other, here's an exploratory analysis to try to get some confidence levels on these things. So what I do here is I create some new outcomes where I estimate basically the treatment effect on your likelihood of engaging in one on the field behavior and one off the field behavior, and test those two against each other. Then your likelihood of engaging, whether you engaged in 2 on the field behaviors and 2 off the field behaviors, test those against each other. And then whether you engage in all 3 behaviors on the field versus off the field, test those against each other and do the same for treatment versus control. And so it ends up being a difference in difference setup. So I just subtract those two different treatment effects basically for on the field and off the field at each stage to come up with these 6 new outcomes. And then I get the confidence intervals using just a block bootstrap method where I'm cluster resampling at the team level. And so it does seem like when we try to look at this more systematically that there actually is a difference when you compare the on the field versus off the field outcomes, where whether you're looking at if you engage in 1 or 2 or all 3 behaviors, there does seem to be this pattern where players on mixed teams are more likely to engage in on the field behaviors, but not off the field. So why is this the case? How did these results unfold? So first looking at the kind of positive result, which is that we did improve behaviors toward the guys who you knew. I test 4 different mechanisms, some quantitatively, some qualitatively. So first looking at 2 mechanisms which loom large in the contact literature. One is information. So are you gaining more information about Muslims through contact? And I don't see that when I look at subgroup analyses, so heterogeneous treatment effects by baseline level of information about Muslims. I also don't find any difference in treatment effects when you look at baseline empathy. So it doesn't seem like we're necessarily increasing empathy either, whether you break that apart into a subgroup analysis based on baseline empathy or actually looking at empathy as an outcome at endline. I do find some evidence that having a positive experience is important in driving these effects. So team success seemed really important. So the teams that actually reached the finals had these boosted treatment effects across the board, actually, including on the generalized behaviors toward Muslims more broadly.
A quick question about the mechanism, Salma. So and let's do a question that John had, which is who are the type of Christians who are like willing to be in this league where there's a potential that there might be Muslims coming in? Like, are they more open, more open to the contact, have more greater empathy, they have the right type of norms? And then on the opposite side is like, are the Muslims coming in, are they more open to contact with Christians? And so that might impact on the mechanism. So we could just, I know we haven't got much time, but like just have a quick comment about that, because I think it's a really important question.
Sure. So just looking at like dropout rates and retention, the Christians who signed up were retained almost entirely throughout the study. The ones who dropped out either dropped out before the treatment assignments were made. That was just a couple of them. And then there were a couple more who dropped out because they sustained injuries during the league itself. So that suggests to me that I don't think there was like a lot of selection. Anecdotally, there was one team in particular that was actually affiliated with not a secessionist, but kind of a Christian local, let's say, nationalist movement. And they actually got assigned to the treatment and they were really not happy. They were really not happy about it. And they're like, we're going to walk. And we're like, okay, that's up to you. And then a few days later, they basically came back. They're like, okay, fine. And so that was the group I was a little bit worried about, and it panned out and they actually stayed. And that was who I'd consider to be kind of the most extreme among the teams who played. In terms of Muslims, I think there's probably a little bit of selection. We didn't have a lot of Muslims we went up to where they said, no, we're not going to play. So they actually all agreed to join, but I think they were very calculated a little bit in what they would say. And they were like very much like monitoring like how they behaved together. And with the Christians, they didn't want to cause problems, basically. Like they were very aware of the fact that they were the minority on these teams and they were super friendly. And so I think maybe it would have been different, as Matt said, if the status was like 50-50 on the teams. But since they were a minority, like they were very much like a little bit more subdued maybe than they would normally be. But I don't think that affects the first stage of selection.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And so lastly, I think there's some evidence also that the contact itself changed norms around the acceptability of contact. So as I mentioned, the vast majority of teams had never trained with Muslims before, and even just that norm of whether it's okay to train with Muslims just in a soccer team, that seemed to change among the players. And I also have some correlational evidence that this might have spilled over to residents as well. So here's some quotes from the players who were interviewed about 3 months after the leagues ended. So one guy said, honestly, you would never see Muslims playing with a Christian team before. This is the first time because of the league. And that's also borne out in the baseline data. Another guy said, when the game is over, we hug and we kiss even when we lose. This was really a huge thing. So these kind of micro gestures that suggest that you're just feeling more friendly towards someone, that really seems like something that was boosted. We see each other in the neighborhood, call each other for a glass of tea or coffee or in a cafe, and we're still in touch. So this suggests that there were some friendships that were born out. And this seems to have spilled over a little bit into the local residents as well. So here's a picture of a league game on the left. So hundreds of people would line the field and watch these games. We improved the pitch later on, by the way, so don't be horrified by the quality of that AstroTurf. And so here we interviewed a sample of local residents right after, or maybe 2 weeks before the leagues ended, and then again 3 months later. And so this is purely correlational, but it looks like if you attended the final game, which was like a big ceremony and a lot of fanfare, and we invited the residents to that, attending the final makes you more likely to say 3 months later that the leagues had a positive experience on your community. And then moving from the first to the fourth quartile in the number of games attended. So I think it was moving from like 7 games to 20 games or something like that. It also made you a bit more likely to say that you would actually support other mixed activities in the area. So the examples that were given were women's volleyball and gardening clubs. So there seems to be something where people get a little bit more used to the idea of cooperating with Muslims for various purposes and activities. So there's a big puzzle here, which is why do we see this movement for on the field but not off the field outcomes? These are my best guesses, but this is something that needs to be really studied more systematically. The first, and this is where I'm leaning, is that it might just be a step too far to expect people to trust strangers after this really difficult conflict experience. So I always think about, like, for example, here's a picture of a young man in the leagues. A lot of people brought pictures, actually, this was quite common, like in the lineups before the game, they would bring pictures of their family members who had passed away, often from the fighting. And so this is someone who's like, this is like a very deep trauma that you carry with you. At the same time, you look on the picture on the right, the same guy is like laughing and joking with his Muslim teammates. And to him, there's no psychological disconnect between those two things. And I think that's I think is understandable in many ways. Like, you don't change your broader view on society and how you shouldn't trust strangers because of what happened to you. At the same time, the people who you personally know and vet out and trust, they are seen as an exception. And so it might be that we need to combine these grassroots programs with these policy tools. So things like structural protections for minorities, to really get at the root of intergroup conflict, to be able to move forward and to build that generalized trust. It could also be that the off the field behaviors are more costly. So it's hard to compare these two sets of outcomes. They're nice because they're real world behaviors, but that also comes with a lack of standardization that can make comparability difficult. So going to Mosul, for example, that has like a 40-minute driving time. You have to go through checkpoints, you need gas. That's much more costly economically and psychologically than just voting for someone to receive an award. And lastly, and this is one explanation that the contact literature would propose, in order for effects to generalize from the people you meet, your contact partners, to that group more broadly, some contact theorists will say you need to see your contact partners as being typical. So that typicality is what allows you to make that inference and to make that generalization. And so it could be that these guys did not view their teammates as being typical Muslims. So speaking about generalizability, so I didn't manipulate the conditions of contact, but my 2 cents on this, I think it was important that the leagues were apolitical, that there was like, and this speaks to the selection idea as well. So one of the research manager, actually, who himself is from this community, said, oh, this phrase like intergroup dialogue and interfaith tolerance, like these phrases have done more to make people hate Christians than anything else. So people are kind of wary and kind of fed up of these dialogue programs in this area. And I think it was very valuable that this was seen as completely apolitical. Secondly, I think it was important that it was endorsed by authorities. So here you see a priest who's actually giving out awards after the final game. And on the right, there's this kind of horrifying mascot, which I did not necessarily endorse, but you can see him at the games with members of various armed forces in the area. So this was very much like, it was not taboo to engage in this. And I think that was important for the recruitment. I also think it's important to have a positive experience. That's borne out in the data on team success. And I think that this is likely to extend to other settings where you have this like positive, meaningful, cooperative contact. Things like cricket teams, but also classrooms and dorms where we have a lot of evidence. I think there's a lot of similarities in these types of settings. So to wrap up, I've hopefully shown you some causal evidence today from kind of a difficult setting that cooperative contact, as Matt has shown us, can build this everyday social cohesion even after violence. But the big caveat here is that these effects were concentrated among friends and peers and acquaintances, and they didn't necessarily generalize to strangers. And so it seems that transformative change is much more difficult. We could potentially increase the impact of contact through things like spillover effects. So I found some of that with the local residents, but that wasn't experimental evidence, so we need more there. Or potentially transformative change needs some combination with policy tools as well. But on the whole, it seems that these kinds of civic organizations, hearkening back to this Putnam literature, do seem promising for the reason that they actually are little engines for creating those optimal conditions of contact across group lines.
Great.
And I welcome your feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Salma. John, you go first.
Yeah, so that's a really good start, I think, Salma and Matthew, to the problem. And I really do appreciate that you're thinking about external validity, because, you know, it's sort of this idea of, you have athletes, first of all, so you select to be an athlete. I think both of you just have men. So now you're in this world of just male athletes. And then you have this next level of selection, which is agreeing to be part of the experiment. So then that makes you wonder, well, do my results extend to all male athletes? And then the next level of generalizability is maybe all female athletes. And then the next level is all males and females who are non-athletes. But I think what this shows is science is one step at a time, and you're doing the best you can to combine theory with empirical work, well understanding that this is a pretty tight boundary now. Male athletes who have signed up for this particular setting. Nothing wrong with that, but I think it's useful to bring that out, in part because nearly everyone now is talking about external validity and how far does it generalize. I think in most cases, those concerns are largely misspent. In this particular case, I think it's worth having that discussion. And both of you have been open to those issues and saying, here's what we want to do as a first step to apply this particular theory, which I think is really good, and I appreciated it. So Rob, I don't have any other questions besides that point. I want to thank both of you for presenting. And you can see that this research is just going to explode as more and more people jump into this area, and there are a lot of open questions. I want to also thank everyone for coming along with us on this ride. As Rob mentioned, we will pause this for a moment. It's not because we can't find great speakers or we can't have a bunch of people join. As you saw, close to 200 people joined today. It's more because demands and higher demands are being placed on people's time. And now what we found is roughly 10 or 20 other competing seminars, including 5 or 6 at the University of Chicago that are now starting up again because the quarter's starting. So we're going to place a pause. My guess is we'll be back, and we'll probably be back sometime in the winter when people press us a bit. How about having another VAIF? But in the meantime, I want to thank everyone, all the presenters, all the people who have joined in. I was looking through a bunch of names. All kinds of people are coming back, and they're asking questions and being active. So I want to thank all of you. And I will turn it over to Rob to give an advertisement for AFE this year.
Yeah, thanks, John. Like I say, thank you to Salma and Matt as well for those 2 presentations. Really, really great. And thank you all for coming every week. I think we nearly had 20 seminars, which have been awesome. We've had we've had very senior people in the field. We've had junior people on a range of disciplines. So thank you all for taking part. And as John said, in 2 weeks' time, we have our annual Advances of a Field Experiments Conference. Diana Smith will hopefully send a reminder email to you all to participate. We've got 3 great keynotes. We've got a range of different panels talking about, as John was saying, external validity. We got panels on doing experiments in business and organizations and experiments in thinking about gender discrimination. So we have a lot of different variety of speakers and papers. I think we have about 80 video downloads of the presentations. So if you signed up, you can see those. They're like 5-minute clips of each paper. People have been very kind with their time in doing those. So we're very much looking forward to seeing you all there. And as John was saying, this is probably a pause button rather than a final stop. If there's more demand for this in the future, we'll definitely get this open again, because it's been great for me anyway as a young researcher to see all the different types of papers, different types of methods of the field experiments being used, and also different types of theories. So thank you all for joining today, and hopefully we'll see you at the conference.
Salma and Matthew, thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Stay safe and healthy.